Hi, this is Dr. Parker. This is a screencast for an introduction to the Book of the Duchess. This is, I don't know how to get rid of that little, well, there it goes, disappeared on its own. The Book of the Duchess is the first thing you're reading by Chaucer, and it is, in fact, one of the earliest things you know of that he wrote. It is an occasional poem, meaning that it is written on the occasion of, we think, probably the 1 year anniversary of the death of Blanche, who was the wife of John of Gaunt, who was a patron of Chaucer's and a friend of his. This is one of the great medieval love stories, supposedly, is Blanche and John. And here is an engraving of their tomb, which was in the old St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, St. Paul's, of course, burned down in 1666, and then the new St. Paul's, which is the one that you would know, was designed by Christopher Wren and was built on the same site. So this tomb is lost, but this is an engraving of what it looked like. John did have two other wives after Blanche, but as you see, he chose to be buried with her as the great love of his life, we think. So there's John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt is wearing some pretty snazzy armor there and looking pretty gaunt, I guess. You notice his dates are almost exactly the same as Chaucer. Chaucer is 1340 to 1400, give or take a little bit, and John of Gaunt is almost completely coeval with him. These men would have known each other. They would have had a fair amount of contact, although I don't think best friend status, but they would have encountered each other often, and from what we can tell, they were friendly. John is a very important person in late 14th century England. Bear with me, this is a really kind of pixelated family tree here, but I'll show you a clearer one in a second. But if you look at the upper left-hand corner of this, you see Edward III, who was King of England. He dies in 1377, but before that, with his wife Philippa, he has Edward, Lionel, John, Edmund, and actually other sons that are cut off on the right side there. They're too young to be important, unfortunately. Edward the Black Prince was really counted on to be a great king of England. He was much loved. He was ferocious in battle. He was courteous. He was handsome, and all those things that you want your king to be. But if you'll look, you'll see that he actually dies a year before his father. Dies in 1377. But his son, Richard, is put on the throne as part of the sort of British system of primogeniture. So even though Edward has brothers, Lionel, John, Edmund, etc., who are probably older and more suited to reign, Richard is the eldest son of the eldest son, and therefore he gets to be put on the throne. If you know your history and remember that Shakespeare is not exactly accurate to history, although in this case he's helpful, you'll know that Richard is deposed, and you see there Richard II deposed in 1399 and died in 1400, and he is in fact deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, who is the son of John of Gaunt. If you look at, so we've got Edward the Black Prince, then Lionel, then John, who is John of Gaunt, the guy that we're talking about. You'll see by his first wife, Blanche, who is the woman that we're talking about, they have a son, Henry, and Henry Bolingbroke is the eventual Henry IV. So even though John never ascended to the throne, and he really wasn't ever a pretender to the throne, although some people talked about him as a possible candidate, his son rose to the throne. And these are the Wars of the Roses, and we won't talk in great deal about them, but you'll see that John is the Duke of Lancaster, his brother Edmund is the Duke of York. So the houses of Lancaster and York. Here's a much prettier picture, and with a little bit more detail, but this just follows the House of Lancaster. So at the top you see Edward III and John, who is one of his many sons, married to Blanche, who produces Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV, who becomes Henry V. And what you'll also see is that if you look to the right, if you look at John's line with Catherine Swynford, um, he has one child with Constance, a second wife. He has three children with Catherine Swynford, John, Henry, and Thomas. And of those children, John has a child named Margaret who marries Edmund Tudor, and they produce Henry VII, who takes over after the deposition of Henry VI. So John is not only the father of a king of England, Henry IV, but he's the great grandfather of Margaret. Therefore, he's the great great grandfather of Henry VII. So John is clearly a player in royal politics and was famous for it. So moving on a little bit from the history, because that doesn't really figure into the Book of the Duchess, although it helps to explain why John of Gaunt was an important person. The form of this poem, and the first three poems we're reading in here, this poem, the Parliament of Fowls, and the House of Fame, are all in the genre of the dream vision, the visio. And dream vision was a very popular genre in the Middle Ages, especially the late Middle Ages, but throughout the Middle Ages, especially in English. And it occupies this really interesting kind of psychic ground because it's a dream vision. The narrator always says I couldn't sleep, so I fell asleep in my bed, or I went and lay down in a beautiful meadow beside a brook, or he goes to some pleasant place and falls asleep. And he says this vision presented itself to me. And so you as the reader are kind of given the choice. Am I to take this as, is this a literal vision? Is this a true telling to him of a story that happened? Is it divinely inspired somehow? Or is it just nonsense that's made up out of his head? Does it have some kind of portents or some kind of truth to it that I need to pay attention to? And it really is left up to you as the reader. The narrator's making no claim as to some kind of supreme truth to this. He's just sort of reporting it in his fictive way as being, this is honestly what I saw when I closed my eyes. I can't tell you where it came from, and I can't really tell you what it means. Chaucer really takes a lot of delight in it, a little bit in this poem, but especially in the later poems, because it allows him to have fantastical settings and all kinds of nonsensical things going on that would defy logic and reason. But what they do is follow sort of a dream logic. So if you think about your own dreams where you're in your childhood home, but it doesn't look like it, but you know that it is, and for some reason you keep running through the door to get to your exam, but it's covered with saran wrap, or whatever kind of nonsense happens in your dreams. But while you're in the world of the dream, it makes perfect sense. And Chaucer really likes to exploit that for fun, but also, I think, for purposes of meaning that we'll talk about. And that brings me to the idea of Chaucer as a narrator, because Chaucer is almost always the narrator of his works. And what I mean by that is, yes, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote these works, but he also employs as his narrator a character who is named Geoffrey, who shares characteristics with Geoffrey Chaucer, and he talks about himself in the first person. He will refer to himself, not in this poem, but in later poems, as Geoffrey. In the Canterbury Tales, Geoffrey Chaucer is one of the pilgrims on the tale. And it's interesting because you really have to be cautious about this, because Chaucer's narrator persona is not the same as Chaucer, the actual writer. Chaucer as narrator is always a little bit dopey. He's very optimistic. He's very admiring of people that he meets, even when it's pretty clear that they ought not be admired. He is very self-deprecating. He makes fun of his appearance. He makes fun of his weak understanding and intelligence. And I want you to pay attention to that in really everything we read, because, for example, in the Book of the Duchess, the narrator is just dense. I mean, when he comes to the man in black, the main character, and ask him, "Why are you grieving?" And the guy says, "I have lost my queen." And the narrator says, "Well, why are you so upset about a chess game? So you've lost your queen." And it's clear that that's not what he's talking about. It's clear that he means his wife, the queen of his heart. Um, but the narrator in Chaucer's poems is always a little bit dim, and it takes him a little bit longer than really it ought to sort of get it. But it serves a function. For example, in the book of the Duchess, it serves the function of getting the man in black to talk through his grief, to explain patiently and slowly the love he has had for his wife and how profound his loss is. And if the narrator were quick and intelligent, he would have gotten that right away, and the poem would be just 100 lines long. So in this case, Chaucer, as kind of the dopey narrator, is serving the purpose of the poem. And he does in other ways in other poems. But in this one, I think that that's what's going on, in addition to providing some comic relief, which is something Chaucer, the narrator, almost always does for us. So I want to talk about the poetic form of this. Um, Chaucer's a great innovator in poetry. He's going to bring a lot of European forms to English poetry. Chaucer's profession was as a government employee, and for a lot of his life, he was a diplomat, and he lived in different parts of Europe. He went to Italy, he went to Spain, he went to Germany, he went to France, and as a result, he knew these languages. We know that he translated works from Italian. He translated Boccaccio. He translated from French, the Roman de la Rose. He translated from Latin, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. So he went to Europe and he found these different forms of poetry, and he brings lots and lots of them back to England. And Chaucer's poetry is very much English, but it's also a huge departure from almost everything that comes before him in English. So this is an early form, and I want to read you a little bit of this, and then I want to talk about the rhyme and the meter. I have great wonder be this least, who that I live for thine nicht, I may not sleep well nicht nocht, I have so many an idle thirst purely for the fault of sleep, that be me troth I take no cap of nothing. Who it cometh or goeth, nemen is nothing left nor loth. All right, so the rhyme scheme's easy. These are couplets. Light, night, thought. I mean, I'm doing these in modern English, but lish, nish, nosh, thought, slep, cap, goth, loth. So those are easy. A, B, B, C, C, D, D. And he keeps this up through most of the poem. The rhythm's a little bit trickier, but it's a pretty basic 4-beat line. It's a tetrameter. I have great wonder be this least who that I live for thine nicht. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is iambic, an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, and it's 4 beats to the line, so it's tetrameter. Chaucer is going to be the one who brings pentameter to English poetry, which survives through Shakespeare and beyond that, but not yet. He's still writing in the 4-beat line. The 4-beat line can get a little bit sing-songy, da 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 da, and this poem suffers from that a little bit, like most poems written at the time did. But if you had to put a form on this poem, it's rhyming couplets in iambic tetrameter. So the themes of the poem, so finally the parts that we're going to be discussing and talking about. This is a poem about mourning. The man in black has lost his lady. By the way, the characters are not called John of Gaunt and Blanche, but the man in black, we saw that picture of John wearing his black armor, which was very fashionable. Edward the Black Prince was called that because he wore black armor. And then the lady is called white. So Blanche is French for white, so it's pretty clear who they are. So this is a poem about mourning, about the man in black coming to some kind of terms with the loss of his loved one. And it's about talking through that grief, the talking cure. We'll talk about Chaucer as kind of a proto-psychologist. He really thinks about things sometimes very much like a modern psychologist might think about things. And this idea of talking through grief, that if there's just someone to listen, the narrator, and again, this is where the kind of dimness and dopiness of the narrator serves a purpose, because he's able to say, I don't understand, tell me about it again. And so through this sort of repeated conversation about his grief, the man in black gets to kind of work through some of it. And the solace of this poem, the consolation of this poem, and this is, if anything, this is a consolatio poem, which is just a Latin word for a consolation, is this line that you'll see at least twice. It may happen three times, I can't remember. Inam boded. And it is a very multifaceted line. Literally, what nam is a contraction of ne am, which means not am. It's a negation of am. I am nothing but dead. I am. Now, that line, that's kind of a strange thing to say. First of all, if you're dead, it's strange to talk. But in addition to that, inam boded can mean I am completely dead. I'm just as dead as a doornail. In the story of Sais and Alcyone, which we see early in the poem, that's kind of the meaning there. It can also mean I am all but dead, which you might say after a really hard day at work. I'm but dead. I'm just about dead. I'm everything up to the point of being dead, but I'm not that. But the final meaning, and the one where it really shines in this poem, is I am only dead. And again, that sounds like a really bizarre thing to say. Well, isn't death the ultimate bad, worst thing that can happen? And the answer is no. And Chaucer's answer is no. Inam but dead, because as the man in black talks to the narrator about his loss, he says, my loss is greater than you understand. It's worse than you can understand. And she's dead. My wife is dead. And the narrator says, well, did she cheat on you? No. Did she stop loving you? No. So she's dead. She died of illness. She died of the plague, as a matter of fact, as so many people did. And so she's dead, but that's so much better than if she was dead and she had left you, or if she was dead and she had cheated on you, she had lied to you, she had deceived you. So it was actually a beautiful marriage, and she died. And that is not the worst way for a marriage to end. And I think this is, if there's a conclusion to this poem, if the man in black comes to a conclusion, or if Chaucer, not Chaucer narrator, but Chaucer author, wants you to come to a conclusion, it's that death is the end of an earthly relationship. But if it was from a loving and pure and unsullied relationship, then that's by no means the worst thing that could have happened to that relationship, especially because of the inevitability of death. And of course, Chaucer's living in a world where death is common. People die at home. They die. Illnesses don't linger more than a few days because there's usually some secondary or tertiary condition or infection that sort of takes over. So even people, for example, with cancer, leukemia, things like that, normally they didn't know they had it until pretty late. And when they did have it, it was over pretty quickly. So death is something that was present. It was common. It happened to people they knew and loved with some frequency. And it can't be the worst thing. You can't allow yourself to believe that that's the worst of all possible things. It's interesting to me, anyway, that Chaucer doesn't take more of a sort of hardline Christian consolation through this, because he does in other places. I mean, Chaucer certainly a believer, or at least gives lip service to being a believer. But he doesn't give the standard consolation of she's in a better place. She's with her Heavenly Father. And I don't really know why. I mean, there's plenty of poetry from the period that does do that. But Chaucer's not so much concerned with the woman as he is with her widower. And I think his consolation has to take place here in this world before he moves on to next things, to other things. So anyhow, this is just an introduction. I will be giving you things to think about and talk about as discussion questions, and we'll have a back and forth, and then we'll see how we want to proceed from there. If you want another like an audio recording, or if we can just go back and forth on the discussion boards, that's as you know, I'm kind of trying this course out for the first time, so we're just going to have to feel our way through. But I do hope you enjoy the work. I like it a lot. I like it more than than most people like it. I'm not really sure what it is that I'm attracted to about it, but I hope you do get something out of it. Thanks a lot.